In this lecture, I want to take you through an excursion of the Schelde estuary from the past to the present. It has been a very polluted, very heavily degraded ecosystem, and it has been restored to nowadays a quite well functioning ecosystem. And this is based on an integrated approach for the restoration, and that's what I want to. So then the next thing you could ask, of course, is how does this all link to the higher trophic levels? Well, that's the next thing that we will have a look at. So if you look to the higher trophic levels, of course, you immediately think about the fish, but let's start with much smaller organisms, in this case, zooplankton. And in the estuarine systems, there is, of course, a large number of different species, but there is one which is extremely important, and that's the Urotimora affinis. That's a copepod species that you can see in the picture. That is very common all over the world in estuarine areas. And if we look to the concentration, the density of this Urotimora affinis in the freshwater part of the Schelde estuary, then we see that it was hardly present until 2006-2007, when the numbers increased suddenly, and then by that time more or less the whole population was made up by this Urotimora affinis. And that's one very important thing, that we see that we have an increase in a very important zooplankton species. But if we then think about the fish, we see indeed also that the number of fish species did increase quite significantly. And here we see the number of fish species in two different parts. The blue hatched part is near Antwerp, the red one near Steendorp, which is a little bit more upstream in the freshwater part. Near Antwerp, it is in the brackish part, which was already a little bit better, and we see that there the number of species increased. And in the Steendorp part, the red part, we see that already in the beginning simply no species were present, and by now we have 17, 18 species. So clear increase in the number of species. And in the table you can see the number of the different groups of species, the migrants from the marine part, the Diadroma species, estuarine residents, and freshwater species, and also some other ones. This figure is a complicated one, and it is integrating the different aspects. If we start from the fish, there we see that, as in the previous graphs, the density of fish increased starting somewhere 2007, 2008, when the water quality was improving. Then we see that we had more and more fish. The figure above is shrimps. There we see more or less a similar pattern. When there was no when there was no oxygen, and then an increase afterwards. If we look to the upper two parts, then we see the biomass and the numbers of benthic invertebrates, which is mainly oligochaetes. And what do you see there? That we had large numbers in the beginning of the measurements when there was very little oxygen, but oligochaetes and chironomids are able to live in very bad oxygen conditions. But very strange, these disappear when the water quality is better. And we look, if we look to the lower graph, there we see the number of water birds, especially teal, which you can see in the inset, a very nice little duck. And then numbers were increasing until the water quality improved, and then numbers decreased very drastically, which might be related to the decrease in the benthic invertebrates, which were their food. But why we see an increase in fish, a decrease in benthic invertebrates, and a decrease in the birds is still something that we cannot explain, and that is probably due to very complex interactions. So, following the improvement of the water quality, phytoplankton and zooplankton and fish populations are recovering. We had the development of the benthic invertebrates, which is very unclear with consequences for the bird populations. But new problems might arrive, a challenge for the management, as water quality also depends on the morphology and the tides. Okay, so let's continue. So we have seen now several aspects. First of all, the system has changed dramatically over time. We saw that there were changes in the geomorphology, that the geomorphology had an impact on the hydrodynamics, that these were impacted by human activities like dredging and dumping sediment, but that there was a clear link between the geomorphology and the hydrodynamics and the ecological functioning, that we saw an increase in the wastewater treatment facilities, that this has had an impact on the water quality, but that the water quality on its own is not only impacted by the wastewater treatment plants, but also by the functioning itself. That then also there is a clear link between the water quality and the habitats, that the habitats are having an impact on water quality because they can be a source or a sink of elements, and that the improving water quality has resulted in changes in the higher trophic levels, changes that until now we even cannot all explain in detail. But these were just a summary of, in fact, a large amount of research, and it is now important that we bring these things together towards a more integrated approach, and that's what is the last part of this lecture will deal with. So if we are going to this integrated approach, a basic element is the ecosystem service concept. And the ecosystem services is in fact a unifying concept, but if we want to use it, it requires two basic elements. First of all, we must quantify the ecosystem service, the supply, the delivery of ecosystem services, and we need to understand the demand, because you have the two things. On the one hand, we have the supply, and on the other hand, we have the demand. And the supply and demand must be delivered by the ecosystem itself, the ecosystem which has a number of properties and functions that are then delivering these services to the society, who gets the benefits from it and who can value it. So that is the central scheme of the approach. So then we have to translate, in fact, all our knowledge of the system into the concept of ecosystem services. And we have the ecosystem, the biophysical system, like you can see in the picture, the estuary and the tidal marshes. They are supplying these ecosystem services. But it is important to know what is the service providing unit. Is it the marsh? Is it a tidal flat? Is it the creek in the marsh? What part of the marsh is it? Or what is the ecosystem service provider? Is it the population of bacteria, the denitrifying bacteria? Is it the plants? Is it the zooplankton? What is it? What is the service provider? So that are important elements that we have to translate the basic fundamental ecological knowledge into these concepts of ecosystem services. And then, of course, this leads to know which and how much of an ecosystem service is delivered by what unit, habitat, or species, or a community of species. So the next step is, of course, the quantification of the demand of ecosystem services. And this is very hard because there is, for a population, a need for ecosystem services, but that's very often not very obvious, as the link between the problems that you experience as a population and the underlying loss of ecosystem services delivered by the ecosystems is very often not understood. So you see here again these pictures of the floodings in '76 in Flanders, and then you see the floods, and if there is a flood, there is an immediate demand for stronger infrastructure. We need bigger dikes. But if we think what is the reason of the floods is not the dike, but the reason is the change of the morphology, is in fact partly the diking itself. So it is very crucial that we try to understand if there is a problem, that we think of what is causing the problem and what is the loss of ecosystem services that is at the basis of your problem that you are experiencing. And that is quantification of the demands for ecosystem services. So from the ecosystems, we have the supply of ecosystem services. From the socioeconomic system, we have the demand from ecosystem services. And getting that demand is extremely important, because otherwise we will never look to the ecosystem if we do not understand that we have a demand for ecosystem services. But if we have a demand and there is a supply, if there is a problem, like a flood, this means that there is a mismatch between the supply and the demand. And that is in fact the crucial thing, that based on that mismatch between the demand and the supply, we can derive how much of an ecosystem we need. Because if we see that we do not, that there is a flood, there is no enough flood protection, then we can calculate how much flood protection we need and how much of the ecosystem service is required. So that is the next very important element. So the quantification of the supply, the understanding of the demand, results in the determining the objectives, which and how much services the ecosystem must deliver. That is, of course, extremely important. And again, we come to the long-term vision of the Schelde, where we had the interaction between accessibility, safety, and ecosystem health. And it has these elements which I explained earlier already. But why do I repeat it? Because it is important, because we have these objectives to be translated in ecosystem services. And the safety, that is a buffer against flooding, is buffering the tidal wave, and that is in fact the ecosystem services, protection against floodings by reducing the flood damage, which is then the benefit to the human population, the buffering of the tidal wave, which prevent a further increase in high waters, which is then reducing the probability of a flood. For the accessibility, we change the hydromorphology, but if we can change the hydromorphology in such a way that we reduce the dredging cost, then it is both economic and environmentally a benefit. And from the naturalness, we want to have a resilient ecosystem, which maintaining the water quality and the production, recreation, and following the EU conservation objectives. So then we have an understanding of the ecosystem services. We know on several elements where we have to formulate the objectives. And then comes a very difficult step to calculate the habitat surface that is needed to deliver the different ecosystem services to obtain then your objectives. So that is the next step. And therefore we follow in fact a very simple scheme, and the idea behind that is the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is a very well-known concept in ecology, of course, and which is describing the size of a population that an area can sustain in a sustainable way for a long time. And that's very typical. You have a savanna area, you have a number of herbivores which are able to feed there. If your population of herbivores is too high, then the vegetation will be completely eaten and the population will crash. So that is the concept of carrying capacity. And the conservation objectives, that's what do you want to protect, can be formulated in the way that you look to the carrying capacity. And you can look for, if you want a species and you want as an objective a certain population, let's say you want to protect 100 pairs of breeding redshank. typical marsh breeding species. If you know that in a marsh of that given quality you have 1 pair per hectare and you want to protect 100 pairs, then you know that you need a surface of 100 hectares to have enough place for having 100 pairs of redshank. So that is the carrying capacity in the area is 1 pair per hectare. If you want that, then you need 100 hectares. And in fact, the same reasoning can be kept for ecosystem services. So it is not the species, but it is the function that is important. And you want, for instance, to be able to store 1 million cubic meters of water, because that is important for flood protection. So if we go to protect that, and you know that in a marsh with that topographic level, you can store 1,000 cubic meters of water per hectare, and you need 1 million, then you need that you know that you need 1,000 hectares to store that 1 million cubic meters. So that is the surface that you need for that function. And you can calculate that for different functions. So in fact, you can make a kind of calculation based on your objectives for species, but also for your objective for ecosystem services, how much surface of which habitat you need to protect to deliver you the number of ecosystem service that you want. And that's based, in fact, on the simple idea of ecosystem of carrying capacity. So if we know the mismatch between supply and demand, we know what ecosystem services we want and how much we want, and we know what type of habitat, then we can look for where we can find these habitats. And that's the blue arrow going back from that mismatch to the ecosystem. The next step then is very important, that we have the information on which habitat is delivering which service. And each habitat is not as good in delivering each service. And therefore we have here in this table, just as an example of the reasoning. The table itself is not important, it is the concept that is important. So we have in the columns the different habitats, marsh, intertidal, steep, intertidal, flat, and so on. And we have in the rows the several ecosystem services. And you can see that some habitats are very good in delivering a few of these ecosystem services, whereas other habitats are good in delivering other ones. So that helps us to look if you want to have a certain delivery of an ecosystem service, for what type of habitat do we need to look for. But again, this is not the only thing. It is what type of habitat is important, but how is it along the whole of your estuary? Because the demand for an ecosystem services is not the same in the whole of the area. And therefore here as column, we see the zone in the estuary. So each column is a different part of the estuary, and as the rows, we have now some indicators of ecosystem services. And you can see that for some of them, for instance, the buffering of the freshwater discharge, yes, in the mouth of the estuary, it's very unimportant, because there, of course, there is no freshwater input, but buffering that freshwater input is very important in the upper part of the estuary. Buffering the tidal dissipation, the tidal energy dissipation, so the tidal energy dissipation is very important in the lower part, but not in the upper part, because that's too late. You have to do it in another part. So you can see that dependent on the different ecosystem services, you see that they are important, or that the demand for that service is important in different parts of the estuary. So you need to clearly understand the supply and the demand, but the demand is not homogeneous over the whole system and can be much larger in one part than in another. And that is also, of course, very important to account. And bringing all that together was then done in the Sigma plan, where you can see here a number of different types of projects that then are realized in different parts of the estuary, because in different parts of the estuary we have different problems, and the different problems require different types of habitats to solve these problems. And in total, we would go for restoration of nearly 2,500 extra hectares of marshes along the estuary, as can be seen here in this map. So the map itself is not important. The point is that along the estuary, we restore a large area of tidal marshes to solve the problems of the system. That is also integrated with the development of the harbor. And here you see a map of the harbor area, and all the green patches with a number are in fact nature reserves which are integrated in the development of the harbor. But that's a very complex system which I will not deal with further now. So in the Flemish part with the Sigma plan, we had the whole system that was explained earlier to you. But also we have, of course, the Dutch part of the estuary, and also there in the places of the stars we had some important nature restoration projects following the same lines as I have explained earlier. So the management plan is a combination of different types of projects and different restoration measures. And now it becomes more than time to go into more detail on what type of measures that we are talking about. And we have measures that are very easy that we can apply during maintenance. And here you see that in earlier times we had a lot of problems with erosion of the marshes, which were tackled by building small walls with riprap or stones or whatever. And another option is to use vegetation. As you can see here, the planting of bulrush, which is a typical pioneer species that then can develop nice vegetation zones, reducing the erosion, because these species are typically adapted to these stronger hydrodynamic conditions. But in some cases it is impossible to develop or to plant these plant species, and then you can go to these old-fashioned ways where you do not put riprap, as you can see on the left picture, but you construct with wooden piles and branches that are woven in between these piles, some kind of baskets where the current velocity is very low, and you get very quickly a strong sedimentation. And on the right picture you can see after a few months you hardly see anything anymore of this wooden construction. And in that way you can, instead of having a bank protected entirely by stones, a bank which is now and protected by these wooden constructions in between which you had sedimentation, and you create on a long distance, maybe only a few meters wide, but if you do it on a long distance, quite a significant surface of intertidal flats that can be part of the whole ecosystem functioning. But we need also to restore marshes. And I mentioned already earlier that for the compensation we just restored a marsh by removing the sediment which was deposited there several decades ago. And here you see how this is ongoing. The big lorries are moving all the sediment away, and you see in the lower pictures how the tidal marsh is restoring. So we just restore the level at which then the vegetation can develop. That's also done at another place in between the red lines. That was also a lot of sediment dumped there in former times. That is all removed, and you very clearly see the future of the new development of tidal flats and tidal marshes. So that's in fact very simple, removing the old sediment that was artificially by man put in there to a level where the water could not flow over it anymore, and there was no tidal marsh, just lowering the surface, bringing back very nice tidal marshes in that area. But we can also go further and think about new measures. And what are possible new measures? Well, here you see again that flood control area where you see the low dike, which is overtopped during storm, and the water is flowing back to the estuary at low tide, because you need, of course, the same storage capacity for the next high water. But if you think about that, you could in fact try to optimize this system, because this system is only working a few times a year during storm floods. As you can see here, I've shown that picture also earlier, but this has, from the point of view of safety, a very good functioning. And here you see along the distance of the estuary, the surface of these flood control areas, the ones which are already in blue, the ones after the construction of the big flood control area in Kruibeke, Basel, Rippelmonde, which is finished by now, and then in blue when everything along the new Sigma plan will be finished. The importance of that is seen in this map, in this picture. Along the distance of the estuary again, you see the storm surge water level for a storm, which an actually occurring storm with a return period of once in 100 years. Then in the upper line, you see what is the level of the storm without, and then in green with the construction of the several flood control areas, and you see that we have a reduction in high water levels going up to 80 centimeters. So these flood control areas are delivering a very important ecosystem service, flood protection, which is clearly indicated by these maps. But the question is, it's only water quality. And if we want to go to an integrated approach, we have to think about other issues. And the biogeochemical functioning, which is very important for the water quality, is also at stake. So can we look for bundles of ecosystem services, combining different things in new concepts for management or new management measures? And that was the big goal, the big idea that we had to tackle. And therefore, we came up with another concept. Here you see an aerial picture of our pilot project, Leppenbroek. And in the inset, you see how the classical flood control area is working, but we added one element. In the dike, we made a new inlet, so that not only during storms the dike is overtopped, but that during normal tides, an amount of water can come in through the inlet and flood the area, and in fact create the conditions for the development of a tidal marsh, but at a much lower location than the tidal marshes in the estuary, because behind the dike it has not been flooded for a very long time, so the tidal marshes on the estuary side of the dike are much higher situated than the low-lying polders, which are a flood control area. And if we want to store water, then we need to keep the surface, the volume of the flood control area as big as possible. And then the challenge was to develop a tidal marsh at a level which is much lower than the one in the estuary itself, and having the combination of a functional marsh with a big storage volume for the floodwaters. And so that was the idea that was realized in the project Leppenbroek. And here you see the results of that. First of all, you see one spring neap tidal cycle of the tides, where it's very obvious that during spring tide the high waters are high, the low waters are low, and during neap tide you see that the tidal range is reduced and you have lower high waters and higher low waters. You also see the upper grey line is the level of the tidal marsh at the near the Leppenbroek, at the river side, at the estuary side of the dike. The Leppenbroek is situated more or less 3 meters lower because it has been embanked many hundred years ago, and so it has not been accreting in accordance to the increase in the high water levels. So there is 3 meters difference. In the estuary, it is 3 meters higher than in the polder behind it. That is also the reason that flooding these areas is very important, because it represents a very large volume that can be stored over there. If we look now in more detail, so you have the level of the Schelde and the marshes in the Schelde and in the Leppenbroek. By this system of an inlet through the dike, we were able to develop a tidal system which is following very nicely the spring neap tide cycle, as you can see here, but you have the reduction of the tides by more than 3 meters. So you see that the high water level is 3 meters lower in that pilot project than in the Schelde itself, and also that we still keep the spring neap tide variation over there. So we were able to devise a system in which you have a reduced tidal amplitude and that you could develop a marsh at a much lower level in the flood control areas than the marshes in the estuary itself. But that's nice from a theoretical point of view, but the main question, of course, is do these areas that you create in such a way, which is partly some engineering and then partly some just nature development, do they really function as a functional marsh? And what do we want from a functional marsh is that they deliver silica to the estuary. And if we see here the results of a number of mass balances that were made, then we clearly see that at many occasions there is a clear delivery of silica towards the estuary, a delivery of silica which is occurring at moments that it is very low in the estuary itself. So if we look then to phosphate, there we expect a retention, and in the beginning there was a clear export, and this is of course the result by the fact that this area before we created the tidal marsh was an agricultural land which was heavily fertilized, and in the beginning we see the export of this surplus of phosphate that was present in the area. But in the more recent measurements you clearly see that we always have a retention of phosphorus in this restored marsh. If we look also to the nitrogen, then we see that from the beginning on, all of the mass balances that were measured, there was a net retention of nitrogen in the marsh with on average 1 kilogram of nitrate, which was removed per hectare of marsh, which is quite a significant impact on the water quality. But very important is that we look also to more the details, because the functioning is dependent on a lot of different things. And to explain that, let's go to a little bit more detail on the groundwater dynamics in such a tidal marsh. And in this animation you will see how the water level is changing in function of the tides. And in the upper part you can see the tide in the estuary, and the red line is indicating where we are in that stage. And you see the water level going up, then the whole area is saturated, and then as the time goes on you see the groundwater level decreasing, that is the blue line, until the water level is coming up again, high water, and then you see exactly happening the same. So you have a cycle of floodings where the water floods the marsh, the groundwater is filled and is going up, then the water is going out again, and your groundwater table is lowering, as you can see from these graphs. The previous slide was a natural marsh. This is the restored marsh, where you see more or less the same pattern occurring, although the amount of decrease in the groundwater level is less than in the tidal marsh in the previous slide. And that's an important element to try to look at. And if we look at it, then we see here the bulk density of the natural marsh and of the restored marsh. And that's for the top layer, the upper 15 centimeter, and the deeper part at 60 centimeters. And you can clearly see that there is a huge difference, especially in the lower part of the sediment. If we look to the upper 15 centimeter, then we see that both they have a rather small bulk density. If we look to the deeper part, then we see that the bulk density of the restored marsh is much higher. And why is this? This is because it was an agricultural area, and the compaction by the many years of agricultural activity and certainly the use of heavy machines has resulted in the compaction of that soil. So in the restoration, then we see that simply just flooding an area is not enough, because the soil, the characteristics of the soil in this agricultural land that is then or should become a marsh is completely different than the natural characteristics of marsh sediments, and this is explained here clearly by this bulk density. And in this animation you see the same course, the upper part and the lower part in the natural marsh and in the restored marsh. And all the blue parts are air, or in fact open spaces in the core. And that is clearly indicating that in fact you have a lot of macropores in the soil, in the natural marsh and in the restored marsh, because in the restored marsh that upper part is in fact new sediment that has been deposited after it was flooded by the tides. And there you see extremely well the difference between the restored marsh and the natural marsh, not in the upper layer, because it are both layers that are sedimented by the estuary, but in the lower part you can clearly see very well the impact of compaction. And this has of course a huge impact on the hydrology, because it will be quite obvious that where you have these compacted soils, that there the groundwater currents and the groundwater flow will be much less than in these natural sediments. And indeed, if we make a relation between the hydraulic conductivity and the macroporosity, so the percentage of blue in fact in the previous graph, then you can see that there is a very clear relation, that in the more macroporosity you have, the better your conductivity is. And this is very important, because it is just these benthic processes that are determining the impact on water quality. So you see the water which is overflowing on your marsh platform, infiltrating in the sediment, and there the benthic processes are removing the nitrogen, retaining the phosphorus, and then the water which is flowing back to the creek is having a better water quality. So these processes are very important. If there is no infiltration due to the characteristics of the sediment, then the processes will not work, and the success of the marsh will of course not work as well. So for restoring habitats, we also need clearly to understand how these habitats are working and what are the fundamental processes behind the services that we want them to deliver. So we see that they are delivering the services, which is fine, but what about biodiversity? Well, in this slide, you see that we have already quite a number of species in the Leppenbroek, and I will not go in detail, just have a look to the different species that are occurring, but more or less all the species that occur on the natural marsh are also occurring on our restored marsh. So from the point of view of vegetation, it is also quite successful. If we look to the fish populations, also there we see quite a success in the way that juveniles of several species were found in the marsh, what is also what we expect, that marshes are a nursery or having a nursery function for juvenile fish. And this brings us also to some new insights. And here you see the life cycle of zooplankton, because you know that zooplankton is very important. We discussed that already. And zooplankton, you have the adults, the females have eggs, of course. From the eggs, you see that the first stages are the nauplii, which are nauplii 1, 2, 3, and so on. The nauplii, they will become copepodids. They will metamorphose to the copepods and grow, and then the cycle is fulfilled. But in an estuary, there can be very bad conditions. It can be winter, of course. It can be suddenly very high flood. If there is a very high flood, I mean a flood from fresh water, so a very high discharge from the upper part, they can be flushed out. So it is very important for these species that they have some mechanisms to survive periods of very bad conditions. And therefore, a lot of these species have developed what we call dormancy stages. So that are stages in which the animal can stay for a very long time to survive very difficult periods, which can be extremely freshwater concentration, freshwater flushes, very high salinities, winters, cold, whatever. And that can be either the eggs or nauplii stages or whatever, depending on the species. But what did we do in our Leppenbroek, in our pilot project? We collected core samples of the sediment. We brought these samples to the lab, added water, and each day we collected the water and very carefully added new water, which was completely filtered. And what do you see in several of these sampling sites? We see that there are a large number of these zooplankton species that came out of the sediment. So the sediment of these marshes is not only, or these marshes are not only a nursery area for fish species, so that young fish can grow up in these marshes, but they are also a very important refugium for zooplankton dormancy stages. So during bad periods, zooplankton which is coming in with the water is going to the sediment in a dormancy stage, and when the water conditions or the overall conditions are improving, these dormancy stages can wake up and come to the water column again and go to the estuary. So also for the zooplankton and probably phytoplankton as well, these are extremely important habitats which are driving, in fact, the ecological functioning of the area. This was completely unknown before. So the first pilot project which was realized is then made at many other places, and here you see another area where you still recognize very well the agricultural setting, and you see the tide coming in the area through the sluices. And then we had a very big project, Kruibeke Basel-Ruppermonde, which you see here a map, which is an area of nearly 700 hectares, which was a former agricultural land that is turned into a flood control area with a gradient from complete tidal marsh on the left of the site to more grazing pastures on the right of the site, as you can see from this picture. This is an aerial picture of Kruibeke. And here you see the construction of the dike, which is ongoing. And you see here also the construction of these sluice systems, which are required for the development of these flood control areas with controlled reduced tide. And then here you see the inlet sluices and the outlet sluices after they have been finished, but they are not functional yet because they are not connected to the estuary. And here you see the first time that the water was coming through the sluices, moving into the area, changing the agricultural land back to a tidal. And I was happy enough that the name of the sluice was given my name. And here you see also a little movie, if you click that, of the inauguration of these sluices together with the Minister of the Environment. Here you see also some movies of the first time it was flooded during the storm. first time that it was indeed completely flooded. You see the dike being overtopped by the estuary and filling gradually the area in which you can still recognize the former agricultural patterns that by now completely disappeared. So we can use regular maintenance to create some tidal flats or tidal marshes. We can remove sediment from marshes that previously has been raised. We can change the flood control areas into flood control areas with a controlled reduced tide. And the next possible measure is the managed realignment, just to remove the dike and let the tide come in entirely. And that in fact happened by accident in 1901. And here you see an aerial picture of the area in 1990 before the dike breached, which is an agricultural area. And to the right, you see the same area in 1998. And you clearly see that there is a breach in the dike, and on a short period of time, the former agricultural land changed entirely into a tidal marsh, as you can clearly see in these pictures. This is another example of a managed retreat, or two small sites where you can see that the dike has been breached on the lower part of the slide, and that the two zones A and B are developing now as tidal flats and then probably later tidal marshes. That's also another one more upstream, the Waymeers, where you also see that the creek is formed and the whole area is developing to a tidal marsh. The biggest project which is being realized by now is the Hedwige Prosperpolder, which is 450 hectares, which is agricultural land by now, the upper picture, and will become a tidal marsh as we seen in the artist impression in the lower part. Here you see how it will look like with the indication of the tidal creeks that will be developed to flood the whole area. And that's part of all of the projects along the Sigma plan. So we have understood the supply of services, we have understood the demand for ecosystem services, we have changed that in a demand or in a surface of habitat that needs to be created, and we have also managed the area in a way so that the delivery of these services is becoming optimal to reach the goals from the whole area. And it is also in the management, it is not only creating the habitats, but also in the management that you can do a lot. And therefore we have what we call the morphological dredging, where you just dispose the sediments in such a way that they can help to develop the morphology that we want. And by just disposing through a diffuser the sediment on the top of an eroding tidal flat, then you can in fact create, here you see the top of the tidal flat, the colors indicate the topographic height, the redder the higher, the bluer the deeper, and it was eroding very much. Well, with this diffuser, there the sediment is deposited at the tip of this tidal flat, which is eroding, and the currents are now bringing these sediments which are deposited below the low water line. These are brought up by the currents. So in fact, you use your dredge material to create your tidal flats or to restore the tidal flats. So you counteract, in fact, the hydrodynamics here, but this is part then of your management, which is then, of course, also very beneficial. So we can do a lot. We can implement a lot of projects. But of course, it is also very important that you can evaluate what you are doing. So also we have developed an evaluation scheme, which is based on a number of measurements. So the monitoring is very important. And we had the kind of schemes like given here, where we had for safety, accessibility, and naturalness, the elements of the integrated plan, a number of communication indicators, because the system is very complex, but to explain the complexity of the system to everybody is of course also impossible. And therefore we select for each of these elements, each of these functions, a communication indicator, which is easy to understand. But to know if this is a communication indicator, what does it indicate? We need test parameters. And that's a limited number that can be tested in an unambiguous way and be evaluated if it is sufficient or not, if it is good or not. But these test parameters are based on calculation parameters that are just increasing the complexity. And this can then be on their turn interpreted based by explanatory parameters, which can explain why a calculation parameter meets or doesn't meet a criterion. And then it can be favorable, then this means nothing has to do, or it can be unfavorable. If we know why, then you can take the measures. If we don't know why, then you need further investigation. So that is in fact a complex evaluation scheme that is developed, which is taken into account all the scientific knowledge, but translating it into a communication indicator, which is easy to communicate to the broader public and the politicians. So we come gradually to the end, and we see that we have started from a detailed diagnosis of the system, made the problems of the previous management measures very clear, that the concept of ecosystem services was crucial to make a change in the mindset towards a new management based on the possibility to integrate different objectives and show also the economic value of more nature-based solutions. And this means that it is much more than just making a new habitat, and the integrated approach requires the understanding of the whole system functioning and the insight into the trends of the major driving forces. The hydrodynamics, the morphology and the ecology are closely linked, and you need to formulate objectives in a more integrated way, and restoration is more than just saying these and these species we want, and that's what we go into, a process-based restoration. We go to the processes which are maintaining the habitats and not just to the patterns but to processes. That is very important. And I can mention that for the Schelde case, the concept of ecosystem services has been very important because it has facilitated the communication between the different stakeholders. It has allowed a more integrated approach and to formulate objectives for the different parts of the system, and it has also impacted the outcome of the project. Without using the concept of ecosystem services, we would not be at the place where we are now. And that's just in a short sequence, the main ideas behind the restoration of the Schelde estuary.